Tension erupts when Jungkook skips a crucial meeting, leaving Taehyung alone, surrounded by silent stares and unspoken questions. What was he hiding? The rain struck the glass ceiling of the conference room like a warning. Taehyung's hand hovered over the untouched cup of coffee, its steam long gone cold. The chairs around him remained vacant. The only sound was the second hand ticking from the large digital wall clock, and the absence of footsteps that should have arrived 28 minutes ago. "He's not coming," a voice whispered from behind the tinted glass. Taehyung didn't look up. He already knew. He'd known the moment the car door had shut that morning, when Jungkook wouldn't meet his eyes. But still, some part of him had hoped foolishly that he'd walk in late but present. That something between them still mattered enough. He clenched his jaw. The papers on the table blurred in his vision, not because of what they said, but because of what wasn't said at all. Hybe had summoned both of them for a closed-door review of the leaked hotel footage. Footage neither had addressed publicly or privately. There was no press statement, no social media clarity, just silence. And now, absence. The door opened again, this time with a firmer click. Manager Seo entered with a furrowed brow and a sigh heavy with implication. He sent word an hour ago, said he's sick. Taehyung didn't react, just nodded once tightly. His throat burned not from the lie, but from the fact that it hurt anyway. Manager Seo laid a folder on the table, the edge of it brushing Taehyung's hand. Inside were printouts, headlines, screenshots, fan theories, frame-by-frame analyses of a shadow behind a curtain, of two silhouettes near a hotel elevator, of a moment that should have stayed between them. "Is there anything you want to clarify?" Seo asked gently, though his eyes remained clinical. Taehyung flipped the folder closed. He should be the one answering, not me. Outside, the rain was turning violent. He stood, pushing the chair back with a screech that echoed off the glass and steel walls. His blazer was too tight, his breath too shallow. Every hallway on the way out felt longer than the last, each passing employee more hesitant to meet his gaze. Downstairs, paparazzi had already begun to gather, their camera lenses glinting like sniper scopes in the afternoon gray. Taehyung paused in the lobby, staring out through the glass doors. Somewhere, in some apartment high above the city, Jungkook was probably watching this unfold on his screen. And yet he hadn't shown. He hadn't faced him. The elevator dinged again. Behind him, someone stepped out Jimin. Their eyes met briefly, and the question in Jimin's stare was the same one Taehyung had been trying to silence since last night. Why didn't he come? But Jimin said nothing, just walked past. The silence was louder than any confrontation. Later that night, back in his studio, Taehyung didn't turn on the lights. He sat in the dark, letting the static of an old demo fill the room. His phone buzzed once on the table. It was a message from Jungkook. One line. "I couldn't do it today." Taehyung stared at it. No apology, no explanation, just a confession of cowardice. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, but he didn't reply. He simply turned off the phone, leaned back into the chair, and closed his eyes. For the first time, in a long time, he didn't feel anger. Only the sharp, empty chill of disappointment. Because whatever this was between them, friendship, loyalty, something more, it was beginning to unravel, not from betrayal, but from silence. And the silence was starting to win. The door to Taehyung's studio remained closed for hours. No light escaped from the narrow slit beneath it, and no sound emerged from within except the occasional shift of his chair against the floor, or the distant replay of that same demo looping in the background, raw and unfinished, like the conversation he never got to have. His fingers didn't reach for the piano keys, nor did they type another message. They just hovered in the cold space between thought and action, trembling slightly, caught in a paralysis of emotion. He didn't know if it was the disappointment or the quiet confirmation that this rift between them had grown larger than he thought, that it had become something neither of them dared to name. Not after the hotel, not after the rumors, and certainly not after today. The air was thick with things unsaid, words he had held in for too long, memories that used to bring comfort now pressed against his chest like a stone. The image of Jungkook in that hallway, eyes darting, hand brushing his as if by accident, but it wasn't. Not then. And not in the way his voice had caught that night when he said, "Let's not talk here." But when then? A soft knock interrupted the void. He didn't move at first. The knock came again, gentler this time, like the person on the other side wasn't even sure they wanted to be heard. Taehyung stood slowly, his body heavy, and opened the door with the kind of caution reserved for moments you can't take back. It was Jimin. He didn't smile, didn't offer a hug or a greeting, just walked in slowly, hands buried in his coat pockets, his expression unreadable. "I figured you'd still be here," Jimin said, his voice soft but clear. "You didn't answer my call." Taehyung leaned against the wall, arms crossed, eyes trailing the floor. "Didn't feel like talking." Jimin nodded once, then sat on the couch. His eyes scanned the studio, pausing on the empty mug, the rumpled jacket tossed over the keyboard, the sheet music crumpled in the trash. His gaze eventually settled on Taehyung again. "He texted me too," Jimin said. "Not much. Just sorry." Taehyung scoffed. "That's becoming his specialty lately." Jimin exhaled quietly. "Do you want to talk about it?" "There's nothing to talk about," Taehyung said too quickly. Then he caught himself and lowered his voice. "No, I don't know. What's the point? He doesn't show up, doesn't answer, and when he finally says something, it's always too little, too late." Jimin sat still, letting the silence return before he gently broke it again. "I don't think he knows how to face you." "Then he shouldn't have started something he couldn't finish," Taehyung snapped. "He shouldn't have looked at me like that, said the things he said, held me like he did if all of it meant nothing in daylight." His voice cracked at the end, and that betrayal was no longer just anger, it was hurt, deep and gnawing. Jimin looked at him long and hard. "You're not angry because he missed a meeting, Tae. You're angry because he's running away from you." Taehyung didn't answer. His jaw clenched, his throat tightened. Because it was true. He turned toward the window, watching the neon lights flicker against the slick black streets below. He remembered Jungkook laughing beside him in the studio just weeks ago. The way their fingers brushed when they both reached for the same chord. The way he looked at him like he was the only person that existed in that moment. And then, the shift. The sudden walls. The silence. Jimin rose and walked over to him, placing a tentative hand on his shoulder. "You need to talk to him." Taehyung didn't move. "I don't want to chase someone who keeps running." "Then make him stop," Jimin said softly. "But don't pretend this doesn't hurt you." The room fell still again, but the words lingered like smoke in the air. Later that night, after Jimin left, Taehyung found himself standing at the threshold of Jungkook's apartment building. The rain had stopped, but the wind carried a chill that bit through his coat. He didn't know how he got there. His feet had moved on instinct, as if guided by the one piece of him that still wanted closure. Or maybe reconciliation. He didn't know which. He stared up at the 5th floor. He didn't buzz the intercom. Instead, he turned away, ready to walk, when the door behind him opened. "Taehyung?" The voice was hoarse, raw, familiar. Jungkook stood there in sweatpants and a hoodie, hair a mess, eyes red-rimmed, like he hadn't slept in days. His hand still gripped the door handle, frozen in surprise. "I didn't think you'd come," Jungkook said, voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't plan to," Taehyung replied flatly. They stared at each other for a long moment. "You're mad," Jungkook added, stepping aside. "Come in?" Taehyung hesitated, then walked past him, silent. Inside, the apartment was dim, the air heavy with the scent of coffee and something floral, maybe fabric softener. Familiar, painful, memories clung to every corner. Jungkook rubbed the back of his neck nervously. I know I messed up. Not just today." Taehyung didn't sit. He stood in the middle of the room, arms at his sides, voice steady. "Why are you avoiding me?" Jungkook swallowed hard. "Because I didn't know how to deal with what this was, what I feel. It's confusing, scary." "That's a pathetic excuse," Taehyung said quietly. "You weren't scared when you held my hand in that hotel room. That was different, was it?" Jungkook looked down. "No, that's the problem. It wasn't." Taehyung stepped forward, now just a breath away. Then why, Jungkook? Why disappear? Jungkook's voice broke. Because I didn't want to ruin what we had. Because I thought if we crossed that line, we couldn't go back. But we did cross it, Taehyung whispered. And now you're pretending it never happened. Jungkook closed his eyes, his chest rising and falling with restrained breath. I wanted to tell you. That night, I felt everything, and it scared the hell out of me, because I didn't know what to do with it. And now I hate myself for hurting you. The words struck deep, but they didn't heal. Taehyung turned away, his voice brittle. I stood in that room alone today, Jungkook, not just physically, emotionally. Do you know how humiliating that felt? I'm sorry, Jungkook whispered. I'm tired of hearing that, Taehyung said, then faced him again. Do something about it. They stood in that silence again, heavy, charged, painful. Then Jungkook did something unexpected. He walked over, slowly, deliberately, and reached for Taehyung's hand. Hesitated, then held it. Firm, unwavering. I'll show up, he said. Not just to the next meeting. To you. Taehyung's eyes shimmered, but no tears fell. Not yet. He looked down at their intertwined fingers, then up into Jungkook's eyes. Don't promise me things you can't keep. I won't, Jungkook said. Not again. Taehyung searched his face, his breath shaky. For now, it wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. Of course. I will now continue the story with immersive, uninterrupted cinematic prose, still focused on the emotional complexity and layered tension between Taehyung and Jungkook. The continuation will maintain the tone and style you've asked for. Please give me a moment to write it. Taehyung didn't let go of Jungkook's hand, but he also didn't hold tighter. There was a cautious stillness between them, like two people standing at the edge of something vast and dangerous. Neither willing to jump, but neither ready to walk away. Jungkook's hand was warm, familiar. But now, after everything, even that warmth felt foreign, like something he'd forgotten how to trust. The air between them crackled with unresolved words. Jungkook's eyes searched Taehyung's, searching for some sign, some signal that he wasn't too late, that what they had wasn't irreparably broken. But Taehyung's expression was unreadable, carved from weeks of silence, hardened by disappointment. Let me fix this, Jungkook said, his voice quiet but certain. Taehyung looked away, his jaw tensing. You think showing up now makes it better? No, Jungkook replied. But it's the only place I know to start. There was a long silence. Outside, the wind howled softly through the narrow crack in the window, brushing the curtains like a whisper. In the distance, the city lights flickered, cars passing, lives continuing oblivious to the emotional war taking place in one quiet apartment. Taehyung slowly pulled his hand away. Not violently, just enough. I don't know if I can do this again, he said. Not if it means wondering every day whether you'll disappear the next time it gets too real. Jungkook's breath hitched. I didn't mean to disappear. I was overwhelmed, Tae. Everything got too loud, hype, the footage, the rumors. I didn't know where you and I fit in anymore. You mean you didn't know where we would fit in once the world started watching? Jungkook flinched, because it was true. They had always existed in quiet corners, in glances, in lingering touches when no one was looking. But once the hotel footage leaked, once theories and hashtags started spiraling out of control, the walls that kept their world safe crumbled. And Jungkook had panicked. He hadn't just run from Taehyung, he had run from himself. I was scared of ruining you, he whispered, of being the reason everything fell apart. You not showing up was what ruined everything, Taehyung said, his voice trembling now. Not because it was a meeting, but because I needed you there beside me. Just for once, I needed you to stand with me, not hide behind me. Jungkook swallowed hard, shame rising in his throat like bile. I know. No, you don't, Taehyung said bitterly. Because if you did, you would have been there. You would have looked them in the eye, not left me to carry it alone. Jungkook moved to sit down, running his hands over his face, his voice cracked and vulnerable. I didn't think I deserved to stand next to you. Taehyung stared at him, his chest twisting. So instead, you let me stand alone. There was no triumph in those words, no satisfaction, only hurt. And Jungkook felt every syllable like a blade. He didn't try to defend himself anymore. There was no point. All he could do now was face the wreckage he caused and hope that anything could be salvaged. Do you hate me now? He asked softly. Taehyung didn't answer right away. He stood there, arms crossed, heart splintered, torn between fury and longing. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I don't hate you, he said. That would have been easier. And somehow, that hurt Jungkook more than anything else. The next few minutes passed in silence. Not the kind that was comfortable, but the kind that made every breath feel like glass. Taehyung eventually walked toward the door, and for a moment, Jungkook thought he would leave again. That this time, maybe he'd be the one walking away. But Taehyung didn't open the door. He stood there with his back to Jungkook, staring at the floor, fists clenched at his sides. Then, quietly, he said, I don't know what this is anymore. I don't know what we are. Jungkook slowly rose, standing a few feet behind him. I don't either. But I know I don't want to lose it. It already feels like we have. Then let me find it again, Jungkook pleaded. Let me earn it back. Taehyung turned to him slowly, eyes glistening. You can't fix this with promises, Jungkook. Not this time. I'm not asking you to forgive me tonight. I'm asking you not to give up. Taehyung blinked slowly, the weight of everything they'd been through pressing down on his shoulders. You need to stop running, he said. I will. You need to stop hiding. I will. You need to stop disappearing when it matters most. Jungkook stepped forward. I will. There was something final in the way Taehyung looked at him, like he was setting the last boundary, giving Jungkook one final line not to cross. And Jungkook knew, if he broke this trust again, there would be no coming back. Taehyung's voice dropped to a whisper. Then prove it. And with that, he left. Not with anger, not with drama, but with the quiet devastation of someone who still cared, but couldn't keep bleeding for someone who wouldn't meet him halfway. Jungkook stood in the doorway long after it closed, eyes fixed on the spot where Taehyung had been, heart pounding like thunder in a silent storm. He didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Not when every word replayed in his mind like a confession left hanging in the dark. He opened his phone, staring at the photo of them taken backstage months ago. They were laughing in it. No script, no filter, just them. He tapped the screen once, then twice, then deleted it. Not out of anger, but because he knew he had to stop holding on to snapshots of who they used to be. Morning came, pale and uncertain. Jungkook sat at the edge of his bed, still in yesterday's clothes, staring blankly at the sunrise. He grabbed his hoodie, pulled it over his head, and left the apartment. He didn't tell anyone. He just went, and he knew exactly where to go. Taehyung's studio door was unlocked. Jungkook entered quietly, finding him sitting at the keyboard with headphones on, playing a haunting chord progression. Taehyung didn't look up, but Jungkook knew he'd been heard. He crossed the room and sat silently on the couch. Minutes passed, then Taehyung removed the headphones and set them down. You don't give up easily, he said. No, Jungkook replied. Not on you. Taehyung looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in days. There was still pain in his eyes, but also something else, something faint, like the last flicker of a candle in the wind. You showed up, he said. I will keep showing up, Jungkook said, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Taehyung didn't say anything, just nodded slowly and turned back to the piano. This time, Jungkook stood behind him, and without asking, placed his hand on the keys beside Taehyung's. Together, they played a single note. The note lingered in the air like a breath held between two people, afraid to speak first. Taehyung's hand remained poised above the piano keys, still as stone, while Jungkook's fingers hovered just beside his. Neither moved, neither spoke. The sound they created together was small, delicate, but inside that one note echoed everything they had lost, and everything they might still have the chance to reclaim. Jungkook didn't dare look up, afraid that if he met Taehyung's gaze, the moment would shatter. So he kept his eyes on the keys, listening to the silence that followed, trying to read it like a language. Outside, the light filtering through the blinds grew warmer, spilling golden shadows across the floorboards, as if the world itself was holding its breath along with them. Then, softly, Taehyung pressed another key, a minor chord this time, melancholic, aching. Jungkook followed with a harmonic answer, his hand grazing Taehyung's by accident or fate. The music began to build, not in volume, but in meaning. It wasn't a song they'd written before. It wasn't rehearsed. It was tentative, raw. Their pain turned into melody, their longing whispered in each progression. This was not the kind of music that would ever be performed. It was the kind meant for one room, two souls, and a history they hadn't yet dared to name. As the final chord faded, Taehyung finally spoke, voice hoarse from sleep and emotion. "Do you remember the first song we wrote here?" Jungkook nodded without looking away from the keys. "You had a cold, and your voice cracked on the high note. You said it sounded better that way." "It did," Jungkook said quietly, then turned toward him. "Everything we made back then was imperfect, but it was honest." Taehyung exhaled a laugh, hollow but not cruel. "Is that what you're trying to be now? Honest?" "I'm trying to be everything I wasn't." Taehyung stood from the bench, slowly, as if his body wasn't sure it trusted itself around Jungkook yet. He walked to the far side of the room, hands sliding into his pockets, eyes fixed on the stack of notebooks sitting on the shelf. Some had coffee stains. Others were torn. Most hadn't been touched in months. "You said you didn't want to lose what we had," he said. "But you already did, Jungkook. That version of us, it's gone." "I know," Jungkook said, standing too, "and I'm not trying to go back. I want to build something new, if you'll let me." Taehyung turned slowly, leaning against the wall. "What if I'm not ready?" Jungkook swallowed. "Then I'll wait." A beat passed. Taehyung tilted his head, almost disbelieving. "You're really going to sit here every day until I say it's okay?" Jungkook didn't smile. He didn't joke. "Yes." There was a pause. Then a flicker of something in Taehyung's eyes. A sadness, maybe, or gratitude wearing the face of exhaustion. "I'm tired, Jungkook. I know. I'm angry." "You should be. I don't trust you." Jungkook nodded once. "I'll earn that back." Taehyung closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, his voice was low. "Then don't just show up in my studio. Show up in the hard places. The meetings, the silences, the days when I push you away. Show up when it's inconvenient, when it's ugly, when I'm not the Taehyung you want." "I will," Jungkook said. "Words are cheap. I'll prove it." Taehyung looked at him long and hard. "Then start now." He crossed the room, picked up a folder from the corner, and dropped it onto the desk with a soft thud. Inside were arrangements they'd started together back when things were easier, quieter, before confession slipped into touch, and touch turned into silence. "We're scheduled for studio review tomorrow morning. 9 a.m. Hybe wants a decision on the performance set list." He didn't look at Jungkook. "If you're not there, don't come back here." Jungkook stepped forward. "I'll be there." Taehyung nodded but didn't answer. He just walked to the door, held it open, and waited. Jungkook didn't push for more. He understood what this was. A threshold. Not of forgiveness, but of possibility. He stepped out without another word. The door clicked shut behind him. That night, Jungkook didn't sleep again. He paced his apartment until dawn, rehearsing every note of the songs in that folder, every harmony they'd left half-finished. When the sun finally cut across his window, he pulled on the same jacket he'd worn to Taehyung's studio and walked to the building with lead in his stomach and something else, something like hope, gnawing at his chest. Taehyung was already there when he arrived. He was sitting at the mixing console, headphones on, scribbling on a notepad. He didn't acknowledge Jungkook at first, and Jungkook didn't interrupt. He simply walked in, sat beside him, and opened the folder. For the next 4 hours, they worked. No small talk, no laughter, No, remember when. Only the sound of instruments, feedback, and the occasional correction passed between them. And yet, somehow, it felt like more progress than any apology. At one point, Taehyung reached across the table to adjust the setting, and their hands brushed. Neither flinched, but neither lingered. When they took a break, Taehyung stepped outside for air. Jungkook followed a few minutes later, finding him standing beneath the overhang, watching the clouds gather again. It might rain, Jungkook said. Taehyung didn't look at him. Let it. Jungkook leaned against the wall beside him, pulling his hood up. You ever think we made a mistake? Taehyung glanced at him. Which part? Crossing the line. Taehyung hesitated. Sometimes. Jungkook's throat tightened. I don't. Taehyung didn't respond. The silence stretched again, this time less painful. Finally, Jungkook turned to him. If you could go back, would you change what happened in that hotel room? Taehyung met his eyes. No. Jungkook's breath hitched. But I would change what happened after, Taehyung said. I wouldn't have waited for you to catch up. I would have kept walking. Jungkook nodded. I would have run after you. Taehyung let out a faint smile. Guess we both messed up. Maybe, Jungkook said. Or maybe this is us figuring out how not to. Taehyung looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, something in his expression softened. Not forgiveness, but maybe faith. A raindrop hit the edge of the railing. Then another. They didn't move. Jungkook turned his palm upward, catching the rain as it fell. You still want to release the track? I do. Then let's finish it. They walked back inside, jackets damp, eyes tired, but hands steady as they picked up their instruments again. This time, when Jungkook harmonized, Taehyung joined without hesitation. Their voices overlapped, intertwined. The pain hadn't vanished. The distance wasn't gone. But the music didn't care. The music always knew where they belonged. And for now, that was enough.
Of course. I'll now continue the next long section of the story in uninterrupted, immersive, emotionally rich English prose, maintaining the same cinematic tone, deep character psychology, and evolving conflict. Please hold while I generate it for you. The studio lights dimmed gradually as evening approached, casting long, warm shadows across the room where Taehyung and Jungkook now sat, facing the console, eyes fixed on the same monitor, yet each lost in his own thoughts. Hours had passed, yet neither of them moved as if the silence between takes was more important than the music itself. The final mix of the song was nearly complete, their voices overlapping and entwined like the quiet echoes of everything they couldn't say out loud. Jungkook had adjusted the final EQ on the bridge 3 times already, but it wasn't perfection he was after. It was a stall, a breath, an excuse to remain in this fragile, shared space a little longer. Taehyung leaned back, exhaling slowly, his face illuminated only by the glow of the monitor. His fingers tapped against his leg, not in impatience but in rhythm. An old habit, one Jungkook remembered from their earliest training days, back when everything felt simple, back before silence ever hurt. Play it again, Taehyung said. Jungkook obeyed, his fingers quick on the keys, and the track began. This time, they didn't listen with the ears of performers or producers. They listened like people trying to understand each other through the only language they hadn't destroyed. Halfway through the chorus, Jungkook's voice cracked, not in the recording but here in real time as he breathed along with it. Taehyung heard it. He didn't say anything. When the final note faded into the silence, neither of them spoke for a long while. Then Jungkook's voice, quiet, barely audible. Do you think they'll know it's about us? Taehyung didn't look at him. They already do. He was right. The lyrics didn't mention names, but they didn't need to. The pauses, the tension, the unspoken confessions in every vocal line, it was all there. Their audience would recognize it. The real ones always did. Not just ARMY, but the ones who watched closely, who felt everything before it was said. Jungkook nodded slowly. Do you mind? Taehyung turned at last, his expression unreadable. No. A silence followed that word, heavy with something Jungkook couldn't quite name. Not forgiveness, not affection, just truth. Jungkook stood up, stretching slightly. I'll tell HYBE to lock this version. No, Taehyung said. Let's do one more take. Jungkook looked at him. Why, it's good. It's not raw enough, Taehyung replied. Not the way we meant it. Jungkook hesitated, then nodded. Okay. They set up the mic again. This time, only Taehyung stood inside the booth. Jungkook stayed behind the glass, watching him through the dim reflection, through the layers of space that still separated them, even after everything. Taehyung adjusted the headphones, closed his eyes, and when the track queued up, he began to sing. His voice was rough at first, hoarse from hours of silence, but as he continued, something broke open. Each note trembled on the edge of confession. Every syllable seemed to ask a question, not of the audience but of Jungkook, who stood motionless on the other side. By the time the final line fell away, Taehyung opened his eyes slowly, breathing heavily. His shoulders slumped, not from exhaustion but release. He took off the headphones and stepped out without a word, brushing past Jungkook on the way to the couch. He collapsed onto it, face buried in his palms. Jungkook didn't say anything. He just sat beside him, the space between them almost non-existent now. And still, neither moved to close it completely. Is it weird, Taehyung said finally, voice muffled, that I don't want to cry but my whole chest feels like it's breaking? Jungkook looked at him. No, it's not weird. I hate this, Taehyung whispered. I know. I hate that you can still make me feel everything and nothing at the same time. Jungkook turned to him. I don't want to be the person who hurts you anymore. Taehyung raised his head, eyes red but dry. Then don't be. Jungkook stared at him, the truth sharp in his chest. I love you, T. The words came out like a wound reopening. Not a declaration, a revelation. One that had been buried beneath ego, fear, and the need to survive their own emotions. Taehyung didn't flinch. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just looked at him. I don't know if I can trust that yet, he said. You don't have to, Jungkook whispered. Not now. Taehyung nodded once. But you said it, that means something. It means everything. The room fell silent again, but this time it was easier. Like they'd stepped through a door and found themselves in a new, unfamiliar space. Not safe, not resolved, but honest. Taehyung pulled his knees up onto the couch and wrapped his arms around them. You know, the worst part wasn't the meeting. Jungkook tilted his head. Then what was? It was waiting for you to text, and realizing you weren't going to. Jungkook's throat tightened. I wanted to. Then why didn't you? Jungkook looked down at his hands. Because I thought if I reached out, you'd say something that would break me. You broke anyway. He nodded. I know. Taehyung sighed. We can't go back. I don't want to go back, Jungkook said. I want us to find something new. Even if it's not what it used to be. Especially because it's not. Taehyung rested his head on the couch cushion and closed his eyes. Then stay. I'm not leaving. Not just here, I mean in this. I'm staying, Jungkook said again, quieter, for as long as you'll let me. And finally, Taehyung reached out, fingers brushing against Jungkook. They didn't hold hands, not fully, not yet. But the touch lingered. And for the first time in a long time, neither of them pulled away. Of course, I will now continue the next long section of the story in immersive, uninterrupted, cinematic English prose, maintaining the emotional depth, subtle tension, and character-driven development as requested. Please hold while I continue writing it. The hours after that moment passed without measure, the studio lights fading into darkness while neither of them moved. The only thing that existed was the sound of the city just beyond the walls, a soft, distant hum of taxis, distant sirens, and the occasional gust of wind. Jungkook stayed where he was, close enough to feel Taehyung's warmth, yet far enough that it didn't overwhelm them. It wasn't about proximity anymore. It was about presence. And this time, he didn't disappear when things grew quiet. Taehyung shifted eventually, his body stretching out along the length of the couch, head resting back against the cushion. His eyes didn't open. He just lay there, breathing, as though trying to map the ache in his chest to something real. Jungkook watched him, silently memorizing every inch of that expression. The exhaustion, the vulnerability, the raw honesty that had been buried for far too long. There was something sacred about the stillness between them, a kind of unspoken truth that didn't need to be shaped into words. But Jungkook also knew that if they were going to survive this, whatever it was, they couldn't keep avoiding the hard conversations. So he spoke carefully. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want to understand how much I hurt you." Taehyung didn't open his eyes. "That's not something I can measure for you." "Then tell me what it felt like." "It felt like I was screaming into a void," Taehyung said quietly. "Like no matter how loud I was, you couldn't hear me, or worse, you chose not to." Jungkook winced. "I didn't know what to say." "You didn't need to say anything," Taehyung said, sitting up now, his voice sharpening slightly. "You just needed to be there. I wasn't asking for a declaration. I was asking for consistency, for presence, for the bare minimum." Jungkook lowered his head. "I failed you." "Yes," Taehyung said bluntly, "you did." The honesty stung, but Jungkook didn't argue. He nodded, accepting the weight of it, carrying it without flinching. "But you're here now," Taehyung added, softer this time, "and I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to know yet," Jungkook replied. "You just have to let me keep showing up." Taehyung exhaled slowly. "I'm not used to letting people come back." "Then let me be the first." They sat in silence again, the tension curling around them like fog. But this time, there was a thread of connection in it, a faint pulse of hope that hadn't existed before. Jungkook stood and walked to the keyboard, fingers brushing over the ivory keys. He pressed down gently, just enough to produce a single soft note. Then another. The chords came slowly but with meaning, and before long. He was building something, not a song, not yet, but a skeleton of one, something that sounded like dusk and regret in the beginning of healing. Taehyung joined him without being asked. He sat beside Jungkook, their shoulders brushing slightly as he placed his hands on the keys. Together they began to play. No talking, no guiding, just creating. Their rhythms aligned like second nature, the years of practice and familiarity filling in the gaps where words had failed. The music swelled, not perfectly, not cleanly, but with heart. It spoke of the nights they spent too far apart, of the things they left unsaid, of the weight they carried in silence. It spoke of longing, of distance, of the fragile act of choosing each other again. When they finished, Taehyung turned to him. "We should record that," he said. Jungkook smiled faintly. "We will." The next few days were filled with the quiet rhythm of rebuilding. They didn't talk about everything. Not yet, but they were around each other. In the studio, at practice. Even in the cafeteria, sharing small, quiet moments that didn't require explanation. The others noticed, of course, but no one said a word. There were glances exchanged, some curious, some relieved, but no one pressed them. Jimin was the first to approach Jungkook alone, cornering him by the vending machine late at night. "You showed up," Jimin said, folding his arms. "I did." "Good," Jimin said. "Don't stop." "I won't. Because if you hurt him again." "I know," Jungkook said quickly. "You won't need to finish that sentence." Jimin studied him for a moment. "He still has walls up." "I know. And it's going to take more than piano duets and late-night texts to take them down." Jungkook met his eyes. "I'm not here to rush him, I'm just here." Jimin nodded, seeming satisfied, then patted Jungkook on the shoulder. "Then keep doing what you're doing." It wasn't easy. Some days were awkward, others were heavy. There were moments when Taehyung would pull away mid-sentence or leave the room without explanation. Moments when the weight of everything they hadn't yet unpacked would settle between them like fog, making it hard to breathe. But Jungkook stayed. And Taehyung noticed. One evening, after a long day of rehearsals and an exhausting round of press interviews, they found themselves alone again in the studio. It was raining outside, the windows streaked with water, and the city lights blurred in the distance. Taehyung sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, a bottle of water resting loosely in his hand. He looked tired, bone-deep tired, but there was a quiet clarity in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "You know," he said, voice soft, "I used to think that if we fell apart it would be because of pressure. The cameras, the schedules, the fans." Jungkook sat beside him, arms resting on his knees. "But it was." "No," Taehyung said, "it was us, our fear, our pride." Jungkook nodded slowly, "Our silence." Taehyung looked over at him. "Do you still love me?" "Yes," Jungkook said without hesitation. "I never stopped." Taehyung exhaled. "Then let's stop pretending we're not holding back." Jungkook's heart stuttered. "What do you mean?" "I mean stop filtering yourself around me," Taehyung said. "Stop calculating your words. If we're going to rebuild anything, it has to be real. I'm afraid if I say too much, I'll break whatever we've just begun to repair." "You already broke it," Taehyung said. "Now let's find out if it's worth putting back together." Jungkook was quiet for a long time. Then he turned toward Taehyung and let it all fall out. "I missed you in ways that hurt. I thought about calling 1,000 times and didn't because I hated myself for what I'd done. I avoided you not because I didn't care, but because I cared too much and didn't know how to fix the wreckage. I love you, not because it's easy, but because it's impossible not to. You terrify me, T, and you're the only one who's ever made me feel like home." Taehyung closed his eyes, his throat tightening. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he leaned in. Slow, deliberate. He rested his head on Jungkook's shoulder. And in that small act, something shifted. Not an answer, but a beginning. Jungkook reached up hesitantly and let his fingers rest against Taehyung's hand. There was no kiss, no grand confessions, just warmth, steady, real. Outside, the rain kept falling. But inside, they had found shelter. Of course, I'll now continue with the next long-form installment in immersive, cinematic English prose, preserving the raw emotional tone, deep psychological insight, and slow-burning character development. Please give me a moment to write the next part. The night deepened outside the studio, the city's pulse quieting into a steady rhythm of distant tires against wet pavement and the low hum of power lines stretching across rooftops. Inside, the room was dim, lit only by the screen of a muted monitor and the soft blue hue from the streetlights filtering through the blinds. Jungkook remained still, his breath sinking unconsciously with the rise and fall of Taehyung's head against his shoulder. The weight there was not heavy, it was grounding. And for once it didn't feel like pressure, it felt like permission. Neither of them spoke for a long while. There was nothing left to say that wasn't already understood, already carved into the aching silence between them. Jungkook's fingers brushed lightly against Taehyung's, not to hold, not to pull, but to acknowledge, "I'm here, I'm staying." Taehyung didn't pull away. Instead, he shifted, turning just enough to let his forehead rest against the side of Jungkook's neck. The warmth of his skin was real, fragile, and suddenly overwhelming. Jungkook closed his eyes. The tension that had lived inside his body for weeks finally exhaled. He didn't need to be perfect in this moment. He didn't need to fix everything. He only needed to be still, present, and not run. That was the hardest part. Not the grand apologies, not the emotional songs, not even the courage to say "I love you." The hardest part was choosing to stay and be seen, fully, with all his cracks showing. "Your heartbeat is fast," Taehyung murmured without moving. Jungkook chuckled under his breath. "So is yours." Taehyung didn't reply, but his fingers curled just slightly around Jungkook's, not tightly, just enough to answer. They stayed like that, breathing together in the dark, until the moment passed and the world outside felt distant again. When Taehyung finally lifted his head, his eyes were soft but sharp, as if he'd found some small piece of clarity that he wasn't ready to name yet. "Do you remember when we first talked about writing that song?" he asked, voice low, husky from fatigue. "The one we never finished." Taehyung nodded. "I do," Jungkook said. "You were sketching lines on a napkin at some diner after rehearsal. And you laughed at the title." "It was dramatic," Jungkook smiled faintly, "but accurate." "It still is," Taehyung whispered. "Do you want to finish it?" Taehyung turned away slightly, eyes finding the window where the city still breathed without them. "I want to start over." Jungkook nodded, understanding. "Then let's write something new." The next day passed in a blur of quiet moments stitched together without ceremony. They didn't force conversation. They didn't dig into old wounds. Instead, they moved gently through the space they shared. Jungkook brewed coffee while Taehyung flipped through cord sheets. They ate lunch side by side in a small cafe near the river, hats pulled low, sunglasses on but still not unnoticed. Fans whispered. Cameras clicked from across the street, but neither of them cared. Because for the first time in weeks, there was no tension in their silence. When they returned to the studio, it was Taehyung who picked up the guitar first. He sat on the floor, knees pulled up, fingers finding an old melody like muscle memory. Jungkook joined with a hum, barely audible, letting his voice bend around the notes without lyrics. They wrote like that, wordlessly, intuitively for hours. And somewhere between dusk and night, a new song was born. It wasn't about the past. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about presence, about choosing someone again even when the scars still hurt. The lyrics didn't promise forever. They promised something better, honesty. When they recorded the first take, Taehyung's voice broke in the second verse. He paused, looked at Jungkook and laughed. "I can't believe I still get nervous." Jungkook smiled. "That's how you know it matters." Taehyung took a deep breath and tried again. This time, his voice didn't falter. By midnight, they had the demo. Taehyung saved the file under a simple title, Us Now. Jungkook didn't say anything, but he felt the weight of it in his chest. It wasn't just a file name. It was a marker. A line in the sand between everything that had broken and everything that still remained. Later, back at Taehyung's place, Jungkook lingered in the entryway, fingers fidgeting with the hem of his sweater. "I should go," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Taehyung leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "You don't have to." Jungkook looked up, surprised. "You can stay," Taehyung added, eyes unreadable, "if you want." Jungkook hesitated, then slowly stepped inside, closing the door behind him. It wasn't about romance. It wasn't about reclaiming something physical. It was about presence, about choosing not to leave. Taehyung pulled an extra blanket from the closet and tossed it onto the couch. Jungkook caught it with a small smile. "I'll take the floor," Jungkook offered. "No, you won't," Taehyung said. "You'll take the couch like always." Jungkook didn't argue. They both changed into soft clothes, silence stretching comfortably between them. Taehyung's home smelled like cedarwood and the faint trace of his cologne, something familiar, grounding. Jungkook settled into the couch, pulling the blanket around him. Just before turning off the lights, Taehyung paused in the hallway. "Don't disappear again," he said softly. Jungkook looked up, voice steady. "I won't." Taehyung nodded and disappeared into his room. The night was quiet, and Jungkook slept. In the following weeks, they found rhythm. Not a routine. Routines felt too rigid, too formal, but a rhythm. They shared coffee in the mornings more often than not. They met in the studio without planning it. Their laughter began to return, not all at once, but in small bursts, in the corners of conversations, in the warmth of shared memories that no longer hurt to touch. Taehyung began, leaving his door ajar at night. Jungkook didn't push, he didn't walk in, but he noticed. Some nights they stayed up talking until sunrise. Other nights they barely spoke at all. But even in silence, the air between them was alive with something that had been missing before: mutual understanding, patience, care that no longer came with conditions. Their new song slowly made its way up the company ladder. HYBE approved the release. The media caught wind of it. Speculation ignited like wildfire. Headlines questioned everything. Were they back? Was the song about reconciliation? Were they just friends? Were they ever just friends? They ignored all of it. When the song finally dropped, it shattered charts within hours. But that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the fans who listened and heard the pain, the growth, the hope woven through every note. What mattered was the message they hadn't needed to say aloud. We're still here. We're not perfect, but we're trying. Taehyung and Jungkook stood on the rooftop of the building that night, watching the city pulse with light below them. The sky was overcast but warm, the wind gentle. "Do you think they'll ever stop asking questions?" Jungkook said. Taehyung smiled faintly. "Probably not." "Does it bother you?" "Not anymore." Jungkook turned to him. "And me?" "You still bother me sometimes," Taehyung said, teasing now. Jungkook laughed, nudging him with his shoulder. Then, without warning, Taehyung reached for his hand. This time he held it fully. No hesitation. And Jungkook held back. Not as a promise, but as proof. They didn't need to be the same boys they were before. They didn't need to erase the mistakes or relive the hurt. They only needed to choose one another again and again, one day at a time. And tonight they did. Absolutely. I will now continue with the next immersive, cinematic segment of the story, maintaining the emotionally rich tone, deep character psychology, and uninterrupted narrative flow as you've instructed. Please give me a moment while I write the continuation. The days that followed were quiet, not in the absence of sound but in the way hearts slowly relearned to beat beside each other. The chaos of schedules returned, filming, rehearsals, interviews, briefings, but this time Jungkook and Taehyung moved through it like two forces no longer pushing against each other. They didn't announce anything, didn't post cryptic captions or share matching photos. They didn't need to. Presence spoke louder than speculation, and this time they didn't flinch from the eyes watching them. Still, some moments were harder than others. There were flashes, brief, sharp reminders of what they had risked, of how thin the line between closeness and collapse still was. One morning during vocal rehearsals for a group project, a question thrown by a director, something innocuous, something like, "Jungkook, can you try it more like Taehyung's version?" made both of them freeze. Not visibly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but between them the air changed. Jungkook's jaw had tensed. Taehyung's eyes had dropped to the floor. It was subtle, quiet, and yet undeniable. Because that's how wounds worked. They didn't always scream. Sometimes they whispered. Later that night, as they walked together down the hallway of the studio, Jungkook reached out and stopped Taehyung with a hand on his arm. The hallway was dim, empty except for them, a soft buzzing from the ceiling lights overhead. "I felt you go distant today," Jungkook said carefully. Taehyung didn't deny it. "I was just tired." "Were you?" Jungkook asked, not accusing, just gently. Taehyung's eyes lingered on the floor tiles. "No, I was scared." Jungkook softened. "Of what?" "Of slipping back," Taehyung said, voice so quiet it almost wasn't there. "Of you fatting when things get hard, when comparisons come back, when everything gets loud again." Jungkook stepped closer. "I'm not fatting." Taehyung looked at him then, eyes raw. "Then prove it, not just now, tomorrow, next week, when the pressure builds." "I will." "You say that," Taehyung whispered, "but you've said it before." "I know," Jungkook replied, voice heavy. "And every time I failed, I hated myself more than you ever could. But this version of me, the one standing here right now, I'm not leaving when things get hard. You can hate me if I do, but I won't." Taehyung's lips pressed into a tight line. Then slowly he nodded, just once. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't a promise, but it was a door not closed. Back in the studio later that week, they revisited us, now to prepare for a live performance. HYBE had greenlit a minimalist stage set, intimate lighting, no choreography, just them and the band. The pressure wasn't from the production team this time, but from themselves. This was the first time they would face the audience with a song that was too real to hide behind. The night of the rehearsal, Jungkook watched Taehyung from across the room, the glow from the spotlight catching the outline of his cheekbone, the familiar curve of his mouth as he tested his mic. He looked calm, focused. But Jungkook had learned to read the subtle signals. The way Taehyung's hand gripped the edge of the stool just a little too tightly, the way he blinked slowly, intentionally. They sat down opposite each other on stage. The first notes began. Jungkook's voice carried the opening. Taehyung's eyes didn't leave him. When Taehyung's verse began, something in his tone cracked, not the pitch, not the control, but something underneath, a tremble of meaning, a breath that carried pain. And Jungkook, without thinking, reached across the space between them and placed his hand gently on Taehyung's knee. Taehyung didn't stop singing, didn't falter, but his voice changed. It softened, became warmer, braver. When the final harmony rang out, silence followed. No applause, just stillness. From the control booth, the producer's voice came through the earpiece. Perfect, that's the take. But neither of them moved. Jungkook leaned forward slightly, whispered across the quiet stage. That was the first time I felt like we sang it the same way. Taehyung didn't smile, but his eyes shimmered, because we finally meant it at the same time. The night of the performance came quickly. The auditorium was packed, the lights blinding, the cameras ready. They stood backstage in silence, dressed simply, the air charged between them. Jimin approached them just before the cue. "You don't need luck," he said. "You need to look at each other like you did the first time." Jungkook raised an eyebrow, with fear and wonder. "With everything," Jimin said, then left them with a nod. They stepped into the light. And for 4 minutes, the entire world disappeared. The crowd was silent at first, not out of disinterest but reverence, as if everyone there understood that something fragile was being offered, something real. Jungkook and Taehyung's voices carried through the space like a secret finally told. Every lyric landed like a confession. Every glance between them was a question and an answer all at once. And when it ended, the silence shattered into thunderous applause. But they didn't bow, they didn't perform. They just stood there, breathing hard, hearts pounding, eyes locked. It was Taehyung who reached out first this time, his hand brushing Jungkook, then interlocking. Not because it was choreographed, because it was true. And no one watching missed it. After the show, in the privacy of a dim backstage corridor, Jungkook leaned against the wall, breath still shallow from adrenaline. Taehyung stood beside him, hands in his pockets, shoulders loose for the first time in days. "You did good," Jungkook said. "You too." Silence fell between them, but this one was different. This one was peace. Jungkook glanced over, voice suddenly shy. "Do you ever wonder what it would have been like if we hadn't fallen apart?" Taehyung looked at him, long and steady. "We'd still be pretending." Jungkook nodded. "Then I'm glad we broke." Taehyung tilted his head, curious. "Why?" "Because we came back stronger." Taehyung's eyes softened, his lips parting in something almost like a smile. "Don't say cheesy things." Jungkook grinned. "You love it." "I tolerate it." "You tolerate me." "Barely." They both laughed then, the sound echoing down the corridor like a memory made new. That night back at Taehyung's apartment, they didn't sleep on separate couches. They didn't talk about logistics or songs or media schedules. They didn't say anything they didn't mean. Taehyung reached for Jungkook the moment the lights went out. Jungkook held him. They lay in silence for a long while, the kind that felt full instead of empty. Their fingers rested against each other's ribs, their breath sinking, their hearts no longer racing, but resting. "I'm scared," Taehyung whispered finally. "I know," Jungkook said, "me too. But I still want this." "Then let's keep choosing it." And they did. Not in a loud, perfect way, but in the quiet hours, in the texts that didn't need replies, in the shoulder nudges and the shared water bottles and the inside jokes no one else would ever understand, in the songs, in the silences. They kept showing up. And in a world that demanded spectacle, maybe, that was the most extraordinary thing of all. Absolutely. I will now continue the story exactly as you've instructed, long-form, immersive, uninterrupted, written in deep, cinematic English prose. This continuation will build directly upon the last scene, keeping the emotional packing, psychological realism, and rich sensory details intact. Please give me a moment to write the next full section. The morning crept in slowly, filtered through sheer curtains as a wash of soft gray light. Outside, the city moved as it always did, unaware, unchanged. But inside Taehyung's apartment, time had thinned to a kind of stillness neither of them dared to disrupt. Jungkook woke before the alarm, his body instinctively still, careful not to disturb the quiet weight of Taehyung's head resting against his chest. His arm was numb from holding him through the night, but he didn't move. Not yet. He studied the room, its shadows, the little details he hadn't noticed the last time he was here. The framed photograph of a mountain skyline on the wall, the faint scent of sandalwood in the air, the slight wrinkle in Taehyung's bedsheet where his hand had unconsciously reached for Jungkook in sleep. They had stopped performing for each other. That, more than anything, felt like the turning point. Taehyung stirred minutes later, breath shifting against Jungkook's collarbone. He blinked slowly, and for a second he looked like he didn't quite recognize where he was. Then his eyes met Jungkook's and settled. "Still here," Jungkook said softly. Taehyung didn't respond. He only nodded, then turned his face slightly, resting it deeper into Jungkook's chest. The silence between them wasn't a barrier anymore. It was a bridge. Later, when they moved through the morning routine, coffee brewing, muted television murmuring weather reports in the background, there was a gentleness between them, unspoken but deliberate. Jungkook stood beside Taehyung at the kitchen counter, watching as he reached for a mug, then stopped halfway and offered it to Jungkook instead. "Thanks," Jungkook murmured. Taehyung shrugged, sipping his own coffee. "I remembered you always take the one with the chipped handle." "It's familiar," Jungkook said, smiling. They didn't talk about what the day would bring. Not yet. They knew the press cycle had begun, that their names were trending again, that behind every online compliment was a theory, and behind every theory was a question no one dared to ask outright. Are they back together? Were they ever? The truth didn't fit neatly into those boxes. Back at the label, the hallways were buzzing. Staff whispered around them, not unkindly, but with the fascination that came with witnessing something both unexpected and inevitable. Cameras had captured the hand-holding. The performance had gone viral. The harmony between them had stirred something too raw to ignore. And yet Taehyung and Jungkook walked side by side without explanation. They didn't offer a statement. They didn't need to. Every interaction between them said enough. In the elevator, alone for a rare moment, Taehyung leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Jungkook stood across from him, his eyes scanning the glowing floor numbers ascending. "What happens next?" Taehyung asked, his tone casual but edged with something deeper. Jungkook met his gaze. "What do you want to happen?" Taehyung considered it. "I want us to keep creating, without the fear." "Then that's what we'll do." Taehyung nodded once, almost to himself, and off stage. Jungkook stepped closer, his voice low. "We keep choosing each other, even when no one's looking." Taehyung's throat bobbed with a silent swallow. "That's the part that matters most." And Jungkook, without a trace of hesitation, said, "Then that's the part I'll never get wrong again." The elevator chimed open. They stepped out, eyes forward, shoulders almost brushing. That afternoon, during a brief interview segment for a behind-the-scenes documentary, the producer asked them both a question off script. What was the hardest moment between the two of you this year? Jungkook's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't look at Taehyung. When I didn't show up. The producer was quiet, but the camera stayed rolling. And what was the most important moment? She asked. This time Taehyung answered without pause, when he came back. The interview moved on, but those words lingered long after the crew packed up and left. That night they sat in a private listening room, lights dimmed, a new track playing softly through the studio monitors. It was their second official collaboration since the comeback. This one didn't have layers of production, no dramatic builds, just their voices and a piano. When the final note faded, Jungkook turned in his chair to face him. Do you ever think we're still healing? Taehyung looked at him, expression unreadable. We always will be. Jungkook nodded. Is that okay? Taehyung leaned back, stretching his arms over his head, voice thoughtful. I think love isn't about being healed first. It's about being brave enough to love even when you're still broken. Jungkook's chest ached at that. Then I must love you a lot. Taehyung glanced sideways, one corner of his mouth curling upward. Don't say things like that if you're not going to kiss me after. Jungkook laughed quietly, standing, crossing the small space between them. Then I guess I don't have a choice. And in the hush of that studio, beneath the quiet hum of city lights outside, they kissed, not like it was the first time or the last time, but like it was the real one. The one without fear, without apology. When they pulled apart, Taehyung's hand remained curled behind Jungkook's neck, his thumb brushing lightly along the base of his hairline. Don't disappear, he whispered. I won't, Jungkook whispered back. You're the only place I've ever wanted to stay. Outside, the night deepened. The stars remained hidden behind clouds, but neither of them noticed. Because here, in this moment, they weren't waiting for clarity. They were writing it together, one verse at a time.